Martha sat by the window of her modest home, her gaze lost in the horizon where the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. She often found herself here in the evenings, reminiscing about the life she once had, a life shared with Robert, her late husband. He had passed away suddenly over 3 decades ago, leaving behind a chasm in her heart that had never quite healed. To their children, Robert was a man of unwavering kindness and strength, a father whose memory was cherished and untarnished. But Martha knew that their story wasn't as flawless as it seemed. She carried with her a secret that had lingered in the shadows of her soul for years. A secret in the form of a letter she had written to Robert on the eve of his death, a letter he never got to read. The letter wasn't just a collection of words. It was a piece of Martha's soul. It held everything she had never been able to say aloud: her love for Robert, her regrets, her frustrations, and a desperate plea for understanding. Their marriage had been a blend of joy and sorrow, moments of deep connection interwoven with misunderstandings and silences that stretched longer than they should have. On the night she wrote the letter, they had argued. It wasn't a loud fight, but one of those quiet, piercing disagreements that left both of them feeling isolated. Martha had gone to bed early, her heart heavy, and decided to write down everything she couldn't find the courage to say. She poured her heart out, each word a tear that refused to fall. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and left it on the bedside table, intending to give it to him in the morning. But morning never came in the way she had imagined. Robert passed away in his sleep, leaving Martha in a state of shock and disbelief. The letter remained untouched, unread, its secret sealed as firmly as the lid on his coffin. In the chaos of grief, Martha had tucked the letter away, unable to destroy it yet unwilling to confront it. Over the years, she had convinced herself that it was lost forever, buried under the weight of time and the responsibilities of raising their children alone. She had learned to live with the unspoken words, though the regret of never sharing them stayed with her like a faint, constant ache. Now, as an elderly woman, Martha found herself surrounded by the family she and Robert had built, a family that adored her but knew little of the complexities of her past. To her children, she and Robert had been the epitome of a perfect couple, their love story an example to aspire to. They didn't know about the struggles, the sacrifices, or the compromises that had shaped their marriage. Martha had chosen to keep those details to herself, believing that some truths were better left unspoken. She didn't want to tarnish their father's memory or burden them with the weight of her regrets. But fate had a way of unearthing what was meant to stay hidden. One weekend, her grandson Ethan came to visit. A university student with a passion for history, Ethan loved spending time with his grandmother, listening to her stories and helping her organize old belongings. He often joked that her house was a treasure trove of memories, and Martha appreciated his enthusiasm. That weekend, he decided to tackle the clutter in the attic, a space she rarely ventured into. Martha hesitated but eventually agreed, thinking it might be time to let go of some of the past. Ethan worked tirelessly, sorting through boxes of photographs, letters, and trinkets that seemed to hold decades of forgotten moments. In one of the oldest boxes, tucked beneath a pile of yellowed newspaper clippings and brittle greeting cards, he found a small envelope with Martha's handwriting on it. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible for Robert. Curious, Ethan opened it and began to read. The letter was unlike anything he had expected. It wasn't just a love letter. It was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. Martha had poured her heart into those pages, expressing her love for Robert but also her fears, frustrations, and a plea for him to understand the things she couldn't say. Ethan was stunned. This wasn't the grandmother he knew, the strong, composed matriarch who always seemed to have everything under control. This was a young woman, vulnerable and yearning for connection, trapped in the complexities of a marriage that wasn't as perfect as it seemed. As Ethan finished reading, a wave of emotion swept over him. He felt as though he had intruded on something sacred, a piece of his grandmother's soul that she had kept hidden for decades. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this letter wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a bridge to understanding her in a way he never had before. Yet a question gnawed at him. Should he tell her he had found it? Should he risk reopening old wounds, or should he leave it buried as she had intended? After much deliberation, Ethan decided to show her the letter. He couldn't shake the feeling that its resurfacing wasn't a coincidence. As he approached her that evening, holding the envelope with trembling hands, he had no idea that this simple act would set in motion a series of events that would change their family forever. The day Ethan decided to show the letter to his grandmother was one filled with quiet tension. He hadn't told anyone else about his discovery. Not his parents, not his siblings, and certainly not his grandmother. As he sat in his room that night, the letter resting on his desk like a fragile relic, he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. What if showing it to her only brought her pain? What if she was better off not knowing that this deeply personal piece of her life had been uncovered? But a small voice inside him urged him forward, whispering that perhaps this was an opportunity for something more, an opening for healing, understanding, and connection. Ethan wasn't naive. He knew this wasn't just any old letter. It was filled with the kind of emotions that could change the way someone viewed their entire life. He read it once more, not out of curiosity, but to steel himself for the conversation ahead. Martha's words were so raw, so human. She had written about the love she had for Robert, a love that had endured despite their struggles. But she had also written about her frustrations, about the moments when she had felt invisible, the nights when her silence had been louder than any argument, and the mornings when she had wondered if they were truly happy. And then there was the plea, the part that struck Ethan the hardest. I need you to see me, Robert. Not as your wife or the mother of your children, but as the woman I was before all of this. The woman who fell in love with you not because you were perfect, but because you made her feel like she was enough. Ethan didn't understand everything the letter was trying to say. He was too young, too inexperienced in life to grasp the full depth of Martha's words. But he understood enough to know that it was important, that it mattered in a way most things didn't. And so, after dinner that evening, as the family dispersed and Martha settled into her favorite armchair with a book, Ethan approached her. His heart was pounding, his hands slightly clammy, but he forced himself to speak. Grandma, can I talk to you about something? Martha looked up from her book, her eyes warm and curious. Of course, dear. What's on your mind? Ethan hesitated, his fingers gripping the letter like it might float away if he didn't hold on tight enough. I found something while I was cleaning the attic earlier today. It's a letter. A letter you wrote to Grandpa. For a moment, Martha's expression didn't change. Then slowly her face shifted, her eyes widened, and a shadow of recognition flickered across her features. She set her book down carefully, her hands trembling just enough for Ethan to notice. A letter, she repeated softly. What kind of letter? Ethan took a deep breath and handed it to her. This one. I didn't mean to intrude, Grandma. I found it, and I thought you should have it back. Martha stared at the envelope, her fingers brushing over her own handwriting as if she were trying to confirm it was real. Her breathing became shallow, and for a long time she didn't say a word. Ethan began to worry that he had made a terrible mistake. I'm sorry, he blurted out, breaking the silence. I shouldn't have read it. I didn't mean to. No, Martha interrupted, her voice firmer than he expected. No, it's all right, Ethan. You did nothing wrong. She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I thought this was lost forever. The words came out so softly that Ethan had to strain to hear them. Martha held the letter as though it were something sacred, her mind clearly racing with memories long buried. For a while, she simply sat there, staring at the envelope, her emotions shifting between shock, sadness, and something Ethan couldn't quite identify. Finally, she spoke again. Did you read it?" Ethan nodded reluctantly. "I did. I didn't mean to pry, but once I started, I couldn't stop. It's beautiful, Grandma. It's honest. And it's a heartbreaking." Martha nodded, a sad smile tugging at her lips. That's exactly what was meant to be. She unfolded the letter, her hands trembling as she began to read her own words for the first time in decades. Ethan sat quietly, unsure of what to say or do, as his grandmother was transported back in time. The room was silent except for the faint rustle of paper and the occasional hitch in Martha's breathing. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and set it on the table beside her. "I wrote this the night before Robert died," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. I thought it might help us. That if he read it, he might understand me better, and we could find our way back to each other. But he never got the chance." Ethan leaned forward, his heart breaking for his grandmother. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone about it?" Martha sighed deeply, her gaze fixed on the letter as though it held all the answers to the questions she'd carried for years. "Because some things are too painful to share. I didn't want to taint his memory for your mother and uncles. To them, he was perfect. And maybe I wanted to believe that too." The weight of her words hung in the air. The next morning, Martha awoke with the letter still resting on her bedside table. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind replaying the words she had written so many years ago and the flood of emotions they had unleashed. She hadn't expected Ethan to stumble upon this relic of her past, and she certainly hadn't expected the feelings it would stir within her. But now, the letter was out in the open, and Martha knew she couldn't keep it hidden any longer, not from herself and not from her family. It was time to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. At breakfast, Ethan sat quietly at the table, glancing nervously at his grandmother. He had barely slept, worried about what might come next. Martha could see the concern etched on his face and decided to spare him the burden of secrecy. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady but soft, "I've been thinking about the letter. I think it's time your mother and uncles know about it." Ethan's eyes widened. "Are you sure? You don't have to." "I'm sure," she interrupted gently. "This letter was never meant to be hidden. If anything, it was meant to be shared. I just never had the courage to do it before. But maybe it's time they understand who their father and I really were." By the afternoon, Martha had gathered her children, her daughter Linda, and her two sons, Michael and Daniel, in the living room. They arrived with curiosity and a hint of concern, wondering why their mother had summoned them so unexpectedly. Ethan sat quietly in the corner, unsure of his place in what felt like a deeply personal moment. Martha looked at her children, now adults with lives and families of their own, and felt a pang of both pride and sorrow. They had grown up idolizing their father, seeing him as a hero, and she had let them. She wasn't sure how they would react to the truths she was about to share. Taking a deep breath, she held up the letter. "This," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion, "is a letter I wrote to your father the night before he passed away." Her children exchanged puzzled glances. Linda was the first to speak. "You wrote Dad a letter. Why? What's in it?" Martha hesitated, her grip tightening on the paper. "It's a complicated. This letter was my way of saying things I couldn't bring myself to say out loud. Things about our marriage, about how I felt, about what I needed from him." She paused, her voice faltering for a moment. "He never got to read it. He passed away before I could give it to him." The room fell silent. Michael leaned forward, his brows furrowed. "Why didn't you tell us about this before, Mom?" Martha sighed. "Because I didn't want to burden you. Your father was a wonderful man, and I didn't want to tarnish the way you remember him. But the truth is, our marriage wasn't perfect. We loved each other deeply, but we had our struggles, just like anyone else. In this letter, it was my way of trying to bridge the gap between us. Linda's expression softened, but there was a flicker of hurt in her eyes. So, what does it say? Are you going to read it to us? Martha hesitated, the weight of their expectant gazes pressing down on her. She glanced at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. Her voice trembled at first, but as she continued, it grew steadier, each word carrying the weight of decades of unspoken emotion. I wrote this the night we argued about the future of the family, Martha read. I told him how much I loved him, but how hard it was to feel seen sometimes. I told him about the dreams I had set aside to build our life together, and how I sometimes wondered if he even remembered the woman I was before we became parents. I told him I didn't blame him, but I needed him to understand that I was more than just his wife. I was still me. As Martha's voice filled the room, our children listened in stunned silence. The letter was raw and deeply personal, revealing a side of their parents' marriage they had never imagined. By the time she finished, the room was thick with emotion. Tears streamed down Linda's face, while Michael and Daniel sat quietly, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Michael broke the silence. I had no idea you felt this way, Mom. Dad never talked about any of this. Of course he didn't, Martha replied gently. Your father was a good man, but he wasn't perfect. None of us are. I loved him with all my heart, but that doesn't mean we didn't have our struggles. Daniel frowned, his voice tinged with frustration. But why now? Why tell us all this after all these years? Martha met his gaze, her own eyes filled with both sadness and determination. Because the truth matters, Daniel. I didn't share this to diminish your father's memory. I shared it because it's part of our story. And I think it's important for you to understand that love isn't always perfect. It's messy and hard and beautiful all at the same time. Linda wiped her tears and spoke softly. Thank you for sharing this with us, Mom. I think it makes me love Dad even more, knowing he wasn't perfect, but you loved him anyway. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of tension or uncertainty. It was the silence of a family grappling with a new understanding of their past. Ethan watched from the corner, feeling both out of place and deeply connected to the moment. He had started this unintentionally, and now he could only hope it would lead to something good. As the evening wore on, the family began to talk, really talk, about their memories of Robert, about the things they admired and the things they had never questioned. For the first time in years, it felt like they were seeing him and each other in a new light. And while there were still questions to be answered and emotions to be processed, Martha felt a sense of relief she hadn't known she needed. The letter had been hidden for so long, but now it had finally found its purpose. The days following Martha's emotional revelation were filled with a quiet but palpable tension in the family. The letter had opened a door that couldn't be closed, bringing to light not only the complexities of Robert and Martha's marriage, but also the unspoken dynamics within the family itself. Martha had always been the rock, the steady presence holding everyone together, but now her children were beginning to see her as more than just their mother. She was a woman with her own struggles, dreams, and regrets, a woman who had lived an entire life before they were even born. Despite their initial shock, Linda, Michael, and Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the letter. The raw honesty of their mother's words had struck a chord in each of them, forcing them to confront their own memories of their father and the idealized version of him they had carried for so long. Linda, the eldest and often the most empathetic, was the first to reach out. One evening, as Martha sat in the living room flipping through an old photo album, Linda joined her. Mom, she began hesitantly, can we talk about the letter again? Martha looked up, her expression soft but guarded. Of course, Linda. What's on your mind? Linda hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about feeling unseen and having dreams you gave up for us. I guess I never realized you felt that way. You always seemed so strong, like nothing ever bothered you. Martha smiled faintly, closing the photo album. That's the thing about being a parent, Linda. You learn to put on a brave face because you want your children to feel safe and secure. But that doesn't mean we don't have our own battles. Your father and I loved each other deeply, but our marriage wasn't always easy. And sometimes, love isn't enough to bridge the gaps that life creates. Linda nodded slowly, her eyes misting. I think I understand that now. I've been struggling with my own marriage lately, and reading your letter made me realize that maybe I've been expecting too much from perfection and not enough from effort. Martha reached out and took Linda's hand. Marriage is hard work, my dear. It's about choosing each other every day, even when it's difficult. Your father and I didn't always get it right, but we tried. And that's what matters. Meanwhile, Michael and Daniel were having a conversation of their own. The brothers, who had always been close, found themselves grappling with a shared sense of confusion and unease. It's weird, isn't it? Michael said as they sat on the back porch. Thinking of Dad as someone who wasn't perfect. I always thought he was this larger-than-life figure who could do no wrong. Daniel nodded, his brow furrowed. Yeah, but maybe that's on us. Maybe we were so busy putting him on a pedestal that we never stopped to think about what it was like for them as a couple. Mom must have been carrying all of this alone for so long. The realization hit them both hard. Their mother, the woman who had always seemed invincible, had been carrying the weight of unspoken truths and unresolved feelings for decades. And while they had always admired her strength, they were beginning to see the vulnerability beneath it, a vulnerability that only made their respect for her grow. It was Ethan, however, who became the unexpected catalyst for the next step in the family's journey. Over the weekend, he gathered his cousins and proposed an idea. What if we all sat down and talked about Grandpa? Not just the good stuff, but everything. Mom and Uncle Michael and Uncle Daniel could share their memories, and Grandma could tell us more about their life together. Maybe it's time we stop pretending everything was perfect and start understanding what it really was. The idea was met with some hesitation, but eventually everyone agreed. That Sunday, the entire family gathered in the living room, a mix of anticipation and nervous energy filling the air. Martha sat in her usual armchair, the letter in her lap, while her children and grandchildren formed a loose circle around her. For a moment, no one spoke, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Finally, Linda broke the silence. Mom, would you mind reading the letter to everyone? I think it might help us understand where you and Dad were at that time. Martha hesitated, her eyes scanning the room. She saw the expectant faces of her family, the people she had spent her life loving and protecting, and she knew this was a pivotal moment. Taking a deep breath, she unfolded the letter and began to read. Her voice was steady but emotional, each word resonating with the raw honesty she had poured into it all those years ago. As she read, the family listened intently, their expressions ranging from surprise to sadness to quiet reflection. The letter painted a picture of a marriage that was deeply loving but also deeply human, filled with moments of joy and connection, but also moments of pain and misunderstanding. Martha spoke of her fears, her sacrifices, and her hopes for a future where she and Robert could truly see and understand each other. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Linda was the first to speak, her voice choked with emotion. Mom, I had no idea you felt all of that. I always thought you and Dad had this perfect love story. Martha smiled gently, her own eyes glistening with tears. We did in our own way. But perfection isn't the absence of flaws, Linda. It's finding beauty and strength in the imperfections. Michael leaned forward, his expression earnest. Thank you for sharing this with us, Mom. I think it makes me appreciate you and Dad even more, knowing everything you went through." Daniel nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's like you and Dad weren't just our parents. You were real people with real struggles. And I think that makes your love even more incredible." The grandchildren, too, chimed in with their thoughts, asking questions and sharing their own reflections. The conversation was raw and emotional, but it was also healing. For the first time, the family was able to see Robert and Martha not as idealized figures, but as two people who had loved and struggled and grown together. And in that shared understanding, they found a new kind of closeness, a bond that was deeper and more authentic than ever before. As the evening drew to a close, Martha felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The letter, once a source of pain and regret, had become a bridge, a way to connect with her family and honor the complexity of her and Robert's love. And while there were still questions to explore and emotions to process, Martha knew they had taken the first step toward healing. In the days following Martha's heartfelt reading of the letter, the family began to experience subtle yet profound shifts in their relationships with one another. The raw emotions it had unearthed seemed to linger in the air, prompting conversations that had never been broached before and creating an undercurrent of vulnerability that was both unsettling and healing. For Martha, the act of finally sharing the letter felt like lifting a weight she had carried for decades, but it also revealed a truth she hadn't fully anticipated. The letter had not only been her secret, it had been the unspoken heart of her family's collective narrative. Linda, ever the mediator in the family, was the first to truly grasp the ripple effect of the letter's contents. She found herself replaying her mother's words in her mind, not just about the struggles of marriage, but about the sacrifices her parents had made for their children. One evening, as she was tidying up her kitchen, she called Michael. "Mike," she began, her tone unusually contemplative, "have you been thinking about what Mom said in the letter? About giving up so much for us?" Michael, who was busy organizing files in his home office, paused the question. "Yeah, I have. It's hard not to, It makes me wonder if we ever really saw her or Dad, for that matter, as real people. I mean, they had lives before us, dreams that probably didn't include running a carpool or making sure we had enough for college." Linda laughed softly, though there was an edge of guilt in her voice. "I know. I keep thinking about how much Mom must have held back, how much she chose not to share, because she wanted us to have this picture-perfect view of Dad. And honestly, it kind of makes me angry." "Angry at Mom?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with surprise. "No, not at her," Linda clarified. "At myself. At us. We put her on this pedestal where she wasn't allowed to be anything but strong and perfect. And I think we did the same with Dad. Maybe we were too young to understand, but it feels like we never gave them the space to just be." Michael exhaled deeply, his usual stoicism giving way to a rare moment of vulnerability. "You're right, and I think it's on us now to change that. Mom's still here. We can still show her that she doesn't have to carry everything alone." The siblings' shared reflection soon began to manifest in small but meaningful ways. Linda started calling Martha every evening, not just to check in, but to truly listen, to hear her stories, her memories, and her thoughts without the filter of being Mom. Michael, though less vocal, made a point to visit more often, offering his help with errands or just sitting with Martha in comfortable silence. Daniel, the youngest and often the most guarded, struggled at first to process his feelings. But one afternoon, while helping Martha trim the roses in her garden, he finally broke the silence. "Mom," he began awkwardly, his hands fumbling with the shears, "I've been thinking about what you said in the letter. About feeling unseen. I want you to know that I see you now. Maybe not completely, but I'm trying." Martha looked up from the rose bush, her expression softening. "Thank you, Daniel. That means more to me than you know." and I want you to know that I never blamed any of you for how I felt. You were my joy, even when things were hard." As the family began to recalibrate their relationships with Martha, they also found themselves reassessing their memories of Robert. The letter had revealed a side of him they hadn't known, a man who, despite his love for his family, had struggled with the same human flaws and insecurities as anyone else. For Linda, this realization brought a sense of closeness to her father that she hadn't felt in years. One evening, as she flipped through an old family photo album, she stopped at a picture of Robert holding her as a baby. His smile was radiant, his eyes full of pride, and for the first time, Linda saw not just her father, but a man who had done his best in a world that often demanded more than anyone could give. Michael, on the other hand, found himself grappling with a mix of admiration and frustration. He remembered the moments when his father had been distant, consumed by work or lost in thought, and he couldn't help but wonder if those were the times Robert had been struggling to bridge the gap Martha had described in her letter. "Dad did his best," Michael told himself one evening as he stood in his garage, staring at the old toolbox his father had given him years ago. "And maybe that's all any of us can do." Ethan, the inadvertent catalyst for all of this change, found himself at the center of his family's newfound openness. His cousins, inspired by his courage, began to share their own memories and questions, creating a sense of unity that had been missing for years. Ethan, however, remained deeply introspective. He often wondered if he had done the right thing by bringing the letter to light, but every time he saw the way his family was beginning to heal, he felt a quiet reassurance that perhaps he had. Martha, for her part, watched these changes unfold with a mix of gratitude and quiet pride. She had spent so much of her life keeping her family together, and now for the first time she felt them coming together on their own. The letter had been her unspoken burden for decades, but now it was a bridge, a way for her children and grandchildren to understand not just her and Robert, but themselves. Yet, even as the family grew closer, there were still lingering questions, shadows of the past that refused to fully fade. What had Robert thought in those final days? Had he sensed Martha's inner turmoil, even if he never read her words? And what other secrets might still lie hidden, waiting to be uncovered? Martha knew there was more to their story, more to Robert's story, that had yet to be told. And as she folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, she couldn't shake the feeling that the letter's journey was far from over. The letter had sparked a profound transformation in the family, but its impact also awakened a deep curiosity, particularly in Martha. For decades, she had lived with the certainty that her marriage to Robert was a mixture of joy and unresolved questions. But now, with her family fully aware of the letter, she began to wonder if there were pieces of their story that she herself had overlooked. The questions lingered in her mind, often surfacing in quiet moments. What had Robert truly felt during their final days together? Were there things he wished he had said but never did? One evening, as Martha sat in her living room flipping through the pages of an old journal, she found herself drawn back to a specific entry dated just weeks before Robert's passing. The entry wasn't long, just a few lines scribbled hurriedly during what must have been a particularly busy day, but it hinted at a part of their life she hadn't thought about in years. "Robert came home late again," it read. "He seemed distracted, distant. I asked him if everything was all right, but he brushed it off with a smile and a kiss on the forehead. I wish he would let me in." The memory stirred something in Martha, a nagging feeling that there were pieces of Robert's life she had never fully understood. Determined to uncover more, she began revisiting the remnants of their shared past. Photo albums, letters, receipts for vacations, even Robert's old work documents stored in a dusty box in the attic. Each artifact felt like a breadcrumb, leading her closer to the truth of the man she had loved and lost. Her quest didn't go unnoticed. Linda, ever the attentive daughter, found Martha sorting through an old trunk one afternoon and joined her. "Mom," she asked, sitting cross-legged on the floor, "what are you looking for?" Martha hesitated, holding up a photograph of her and Robert from their honeymoon. I'm not entirely sure, she admitted. I just feel like there's more to Robert's story than I ever knew. And if there is, I want to find it. Linda nodded, her curiosity piqued. Do you think he was keeping something from us? Not necessarily, Martha replied thoughtfully. But I do think there were parts of him he didn't share, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. He was always so focused on taking care of us that I think he forgot to let us take care of him. The conversation stayed with Linda, and over the next few days, she convinced her brothers to help their mother piece together Robert's life. Together, they sifted through boxes of mementos, each discovery sparking a new wave of memories and reflections. They found an envelope filled with receipts from a road trip Robert had taken with Michael, sparking laughter over a story about a flat tire and a roadside diner with the worst pie they'd ever had. They unearthed an old, slightly battered notebook where Robert had meticulously planned the family's finances, his neat handwriting a testament to his determination to provide for them. And then, in a box labeled simply Keepsakes, they found something unexpected. It was a journal bound in dark leather, its pages worn and slightly yellowed with age. On the cover, written in Robert's familiar script, were the words, "For my family." Martha froze when she saw it, her breath catching in her throat. I didn't know he kept a journal, she whispered, her hands trembling as she picked it up. The family gathered around her as she opened it, the air thick with anticipation. The entries were sparse but deeply personal, each one offering a glimpse into Robert's thoughts and feelings during the years they had spent together. He wrote about his love for Martha, his pride in their children, and his fears about not being enough for the family he cherished so deeply. But as they read further, the entries took on a more somber tone. In the final weeks before his death, Robert had written about feeling unwell, about the nagging sense that something was wrong but not wanting to worry his family. "I don't want to burden Martha," one entry read. "She's already done so much for all of us. I'll go to the doctor next week. It's probably nothing." Martha felt a wave of emotion crash over her as she read those words. All these years, she had carried guilt for the things she hadn't said to Robert, but now she realized he had been carrying his own burdens he had kept to himself to protect her. "Oh, Robert," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't you tell me?" Michael placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He loved you, Mom. That's why. He didn't want you to worry." The journal also contained an entry that stopped everyone in their tracks. It was dated the day before Robert's death and described his intention to write Martha a letter in return. "Martha deserves to know how much she means to me," it read. "Tomorrow, I'll tell her everything. How much I love her, how much I've always admired her strength, even when I didn't say it. She deserves to hear it all." Martha clutched the journal to her chest, her sobs shaking her frame. "He was going to write me back," she said, her voice barely audible. "He was going to tell me everything." The discovery of Robert's journal became a turning point for the family. It added new layers to their understanding of him and gave Martha a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. But it also raised more questions. What would Robert have written in his letter? And how might their lives have been different if they had been able to share their truths with each other in those final days? As the family sat together that evening, reflecting on the man they had all loved and the secrets he had carried, Martha spoke with a newfound sense of clarity. "Your father wasn't perfect," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "But he loved us with everything he had. And that's what matters. That's what I want you to remember." The family nodded, their expressions a mix of sadness and gratitude. They had lost Robert years ago, but through his journal and Martha's letter, they felt closer to him than ever before. And as they embraced one another, they knew they were not just honoring his memory, they were continuing the story he had started. The discovery of Robert's journal left the family with a mix of emotions: grief for the burdens he had carried alone, gratitude for the love he had so deeply expressed, and a bittersweet sense of connection to the man they thought they knew completely. For Martha, the journal was both a gift and a challenge. It brought clarity to questions she had lived with for decades, but also stirred up memories and emotions she had long since buried. Yet, amidst the complexity, one thing became clear. It was time to find closure, not just for herself, but for the entire family. Martha decided to honor Robert's memory in a way that allowed everyone to contribute. "I want us to write letters," she announced one evening as the family gathered around the dinner table. Her children and grandchildren looked at her curiously, unsure of what she meant. "Each of us should write a letter to Robert," she explained. "Not just to say goodbye, but to tell him what he meant to us, what we've learned since he's been gone. It's a way for us to heal and to celebrate his life." The idea was met with quiet nods, though it was clear that some family members were unsure how to approach such a deeply personal task. Ethan, who had grown closer to his grandmother through the discovery of the letter, offered to help organize the project. "We can make it a family event," he suggested. "We'll all write our letters and read them together. It'll be like a celebration of Grandpa." Over the next week, the house was filled with the sound of pens scratching against paper and the occasional sniffle as family members worked on their letters. For Linda, it was an opportunity to reflect on her own role as a mother and wife and how her parents' marriage had shaped her understanding of love and resilience. For Michael, it was a chance to confront the moments when he had resented his father's silence and to acknowledge the sacrifices Robert had made for the family. For Daniel, the process was more challenging. Writing had never been his strong suit, and the emotions stirred by the journal and the letter were still raw. But with Martha's gentle encouragement, he found the words to express his love and admiration for the man who had been his role model. Martha's own letter was the most difficult to write. She sat at her desk for hours, staring at the blank page, unsure where to begin. How do you condense a lifetime of love, regret, and gratitude into a single letter? Finally, she decided to write as if she were speaking to Robert in person, letting the words flow naturally. "My dearest Robert," she began, her handwriting steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "For so many years, I've carried the weight of what I didn't say to you, of the letter you never read. But now I realize that what matters most isn't the words left unsaid, but the life we shared and the love we gave to each other and our family. You were my partner, my anchor, and my greatest joy. And even in the moments when we struggled, I never stopped loving you. I hope you knew that." The day of the letter reading arrived with a sense of both anticipation and solemnity. The family gathered in the backyard, where Robert had loved to spend his weekends tending to the garden. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and the golden light of the setting sun cast a warm glow over the scene. Martha sat in her favorite chair, the letters carefully placed in a small wooden box on her lap. "Before we begin," she said, her voice steady but emotional, "I want to thank all of you for doing this. Your father would have been so proud of the love and strength we've shown as a family." Linda volunteered to go first, her voice trembling slightly as she read her letter. She spoke of the lessons she had learned from Robert, his dedication, his quiet strength, and his unwavering love for their family. Michael followed, his tone more measured but no less heartfelt, as he recounted memories of fishing trips and late-night talks that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to be a father. Daniel's letter was brief but deeply moving, filled with gratitude for the sacrifices Robert had made and the example he had set. When it was Martha's turn, the family listened in rapt silence as she read her letter aloud. Her words were a mixture of love and reflection, acknowledging the imperfections of their marriage while celebrating the deep connection they had shared. "You were my partner in every sense of the word," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "And even though I couldn't give you this letter in life, I hope you can feel its meaning now, wherever you are." As the final words of her letter hung in the air, the family sat quietly, their hearts full of emotion. Ethan, always attuned to his grandmother's feelings, stood and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Grandma," he said softly, "this was beautiful. Grandpa would have loved this." Martha smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with both sorrow and peace. "Thank you, Ethan. And thank you all. This means more to me than I can say." The family decided to bury the letters in the garden, beneath a rose bush that Robert had planted years ago. It was a symbolic gesture, a way of laying the past to rest while allowing something beautiful to grow in its place. As they stood together, watching the soil cover the box of letters, Martha felt a sense of closure she hadn't known she needed. The letter she had written so long ago had finally fulfilled its purpose, not as a message to Robert, but as a bridge to her family and a reminder of the love that had always been at the heart of their story. That evening, as the family shared stories and laughter around the dinner table, Martha looked around at the faces of her children and grandchildren. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. The letter, the journal, and the journey they had taken together had brought them closer than ever. And though Robert was gone, his presence was palpable in the love that filled the room. The family had found a sense of peace and closure through the letters, but the journey wasn't quite over. Unbeknownst to Martha and her children, the letter and journal had stirred something far deeper, a secret Robert had carried with him, buried so deeply that it had remained hidden for decades. It was Ethan who unwittingly stumbled upon the final piece of the puzzle, setting into motion a revelation that would challenge everything the family thought they knew. It began one quiet afternoon when Ethan decided to revisit the attic. He had been organizing family photographs and heirlooms, inspired by the catharsis of the letter-writing project, and he wanted to see if there were any other pieces of his grandparents' history waiting to be uncovered. As he rummaged through an old chest filled with books and keepsakes, his hand brushed against a thick, sealed envelope wedged at the bottom. Curious, he pulled it out and noticed that it was addressed to Martha, but in Robert's handwriting. The postmark revealed that it had been sent just a week before his death. Ethan's heart raced as he stared at the envelope. Why had it never been opened? And what could Robert have written to Martha so close to the end of his life? After a moment of hesitation, Ethan brought the envelope downstairs, where Martha was sitting in her favorite chair, knitting. "Grandma," he began, his voice cautious, "I found something that I think you should see." Martha looked up, her brow furrowing as Ethan handed her the envelope. Her breath caught when she saw Robert's handwriting, her fingers trembling as she traced the familiar letters of her name. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the attic," Ethan replied. "It must have been hidden there all these years." Martha's hand shook as she carefully opened the envelope, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. Inside was a letter, written in Robert's neat, deliberate script. The family, sensing the gravity of the moment, gathered around her as she began to read aloud. "My dearest Martha," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to tell you everything I wanted to before I left. There's something I've kept from you, not out of malice, but out of love and perhaps a bit of cowardice. I've carried this secret for so long, and as my time grows short, I realize it's a burden I can no longer bear." Martha's voice wavered, and Linda placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Take your time, Mom," she said softly. Martha took a deep breath and continued. "Before we met, I was in love with someone else. Her name was Eleanor, and she was my world for a time. We were young, foolish, and deeply in love, but life had other plans. She became pregnant, and we planned to marry, but before we could, tragedy struck. Eleanor passed away during childbirth, and our son was given up for adoption." A collective gasp filled the room. Martha lowered the letter, her eyes wide with shock. "He had a son," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael, ever the pragmatist, spoke first. "Dad never mentioned this to anyone. Why would he keep it a secret?" Martha raised the letter again, determined to finish it. When I met you, Martha, you healed something in me I didn't even realize was broken. You gave me hope, love, and a family I never thought I'd have again. But I could never bring myself to tell you about Eleanor or our son. I was afraid you'd think less of me, afraid it would hurt what we had built together. And so I buried it. But now as I face the end, I realize that love isn't about perfection. It's about truth, and this truth belongs to you as much as it belongs to me. Martha's hands fell to her lap, the letter resting limply between her fingers. The room was silent, the weight of Robert's revelation settling over the family like a heavy blanket. He carried this with him all those years, Martha said finally, her voice breaking. He must have been so afraid. And yet, he still gave us so much love. Ethan, ever the intuitive one, spoke up. Grandma, do you think there's a way to find out what happened to his son? Maybe he's still out there. The idea sent a ripple of emotion through the room. Michael and Daniel exchanged uncertain glances, while Linda nodded slowly. It's worth trying, she said. If Dad's son is out there, he deserves to know the truth too. Over the next few weeks, the family worked together to uncover the mystery of Robert's son. They searched through adoption records, contacted agencies, and even used DNA testing to trace potential connections. The journey was challenging, filled with moments of hope and frustration, but eventually, they found what they were looking for, a man named Thomas, living just a few hours away, who matched the description and timeline in Robert's letter. When Martha finally met Thomas, it was a moment of overwhelming emotion. He was in his 60s, with kind eyes that reminded her so much of Robert's, and a gentle demeanor that put her at ease. As they talked, Martha shared stories of the man who had been both her husband and Thomas's father, creating a bridge between two lives that had been separated for so long. For the family, the reunion was both a challenge and a blessing. It forced them to confront the complexities of love, loss, and the secrets that shape us, but also brought them closer together. Through it all, they came to understand that Robert's life, like all lives, was a tapestry of joy and sorrow, mistakes and triumphs, woven together by the love he had for his family. On a sunny afternoon, as they gathered in the garden where Robert's letters had been buried, Martha looked around at her family, including Thomas, and felt a profound sense of peace. The letter she had written so long ago, the letter Robert had written in return, and the journey they had taken together had brought them to this moment. It was a moment of closure, yes, but also a new beginning, a reminder that even in the face of loss, love endures. With a gentle smile, Martha whispered, "Thank you, Robert, for everything." And for the first time in decades, she felt truly free.